The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tina. Thank you also, Eva, for inviting me. Yifan for showing me around beautiful Ghent today. And thank you for coming, everyone here and online. So once again, my name is Dr. Christopher Jain Miller. You can also find me at The Yoga Professor on Instagram if you want to connect after this. It's nice to see so many friendly, familiar faces in the audience and some new people as well. And what I want to present to you today is the title of this is Finding Bliss in Paradise, Kirtan Meditation and the Ukulele in a Hawaiian Yoga Community. That Hawaiian Yoga Community is Polestar Village. They're currently in in Fort Collins, Colorado. But they were originally in Hawaii, on the big island of Hawaii, as Polestar Gardens. And in 2017, my wife and I spent 6 months living there, had a wonderful experience. And I told Michael Gornik, who's here with us today, the co-founder, that I want to write something about you someday. And I kept putting it off. And then finally, my book with Routledge is going to be published in the coming months called Embodying Transnational Yoga. And there's a chapter in there that follows some of the stuff that I will show you here today in this presentation about music in yoga communities, and specifically music in a Hawaiian yoga community, and how the ukulele, if you don't know what that is, you will soon, makes its way into this meditation practice in a very kind of powerful and interesting way. So there's a social history I want to tell here about Indian music, about Yogananda's music, Paramahansa Yogananda, around whom this community is formed. And I want to thank Michael Gornik and Vina Ketty as well for coming, because they're going to play a little something for us at the end of the presentation, a little kirtan for us to let us hear what I'm talking about. I want you to be able to experience it. So I thank them so much for coming. So what I'm going to look at in this presentation, what I really want to show you are 4 entangled phenomena. And it's these 4 things, and they should make sense by the end of this presentation why I'm choosing these 4 things. We're going to look at instruments, the social lives of instruments, the way instruments are used in particular social spaces. We're going to look at intentional living on the big island of Hawaii in this community, Polestar Gardens. We're going to look at some of the late colonial Indian quote-unquote arts and the way that the music that we're hearing at Polestar and we're hearing from Yogananda were part of this social history of the way music was being reformed in India in the late colonial period. And then we're going to look at how all of this is undergirded really by a 13th century musicology from South Asia. So I want to kind of show how the practices that are happening now with the ukulele and whatnot, while on the surface may appear as something totally new, are actually something also simultaneously quite old. And together, I think what this constitutes from the perspective of the community is something called kriya yoga. And I'll explain a little bit about what that means as we go on, but it's an initiatory form of yoga that Yogananda brought to America in the early 20th century and initiated people into. So I am not initiated into kriya yoga, so I can't tell you how to practice kriya yoga, but there are certain elements of it, the preliminary elements of it that are public, in the sense that you can find them on the internet. You can go to the SRF, the Self-Realization Fellowship, or the Polestar, and you can learn them without being initiated. And so there are certain things I will tell and share with you about it today. Now, my sort of home field here in terms of research is the field of modern yoga studies. And up here on the screen, you see a number of recent publications, you could say within the last 20 years or so, that have been sort of foundational. And these aren't all of the publications, there are many. But this is a field that looks at how yoga, for example, transforms in its global encounters as it becomes a transnational cultural phenomena, both now and mostly in the past. There's more ethnography coming out now, and this is what really excites me, because I'm trained as an ethnographer at the University of California, Davis, where I studied with Smriti Srinivas and others who I will mention as I go through this presentation. And I went to the university really wanting to study yoga philosophy, and I was then introduced to this wonderful field of modern yoga studies and ethnography and anthropology, and took it in a different direction, which I think will come out in this presentation, as I'm looking at how Yogananda's yoga, this kriya yoga, moves around the world, but in a very particular place. The categories that modern yoga studies has considered recently, for example, are the way that yoga intersects with things like colonialism, nationalism, capitalism, gender, science, race, and a lot of other things. But all these different categories. And one of the major questions that yoga practitioners ask in this field, or just in general, is how does the practice that I'm doing today, say in the yoga studio, connect or not connect to like ancient, or what they perceive as ancient yogic practices from India? And so I find it really interesting to play with this notion of continuities and discontinuities. What is kind of universal and seems to have been carried through, and what hasn't? And can you kind of parse these things out? And that's what I'm trying to do. Let me give you one quick kind of silly example of what happens with yoga, just so you can get a sense of what I'm talking about. So most of us have probably been to a yoga class before, and you've probably been, or you've seen this chair pose. Has everyone done chair pose before or knows what it is, right? And oftentimes the yoga teacher will make a joke like, we've been in this pose for so long and our legs are burning, and it teaches us a lesson about being strong and so on and so forth. And it has like certain strengthening values. And of course, like here's a common example from Yoga Journal, what they would say about this Utkatasana, which is chair pose. Utkatasana powerfully strengthens the muscles of the arms and the legs, but it also stimulates the diaphragm and heart. So you can see there's a therapeutic kind of dimension to what this is doing for you. It's doing something good for your body. If you go back, for example, to the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, a text that was written probably in the 15th century, the chair pose, Utkatasana, was actually used to administer an enema to yourself. Okay, so it says this: inserting a tube into the anus and adopting the Utkatasana posture in water coming up to the navel, one should contract the anus and wash the interior. This is the Basti Kriya. This is one of the ways that the yogic subtle body was purified, by giving oneself an enema. And Utkatasana in that text is being used for that purpose, right? So you can see that the way that Yoga Journal and popular yoga studios, for example, portray something like Utkatasana as like this leg strengthening exercise, arm strengthening, shoulder, whatever they want to do, its meaning shifts as it enters into new contexts. This is a very simplistic example of kind of what a lot of scholars in yoga studies are looking at, is how these postures and other bodily practices change as they move around the world into different practice and areas of knowledge and power and praxis. The question I most specifically want to get at, though, is what about yoga's music? And this isn't something that's been considered in great detail. There is some stuff out there, but one of the things that I got interested in while I was in the field was being around yoga practitioners who were playing music. When I was at UC Davis doing my PhD, every once in a while they would bring a Kirtan band playing sacred devotional music into the hot yoga studio there. And I would, I would go listen and really enjoy that. And then I went out and I started traveling around, and I went to Hawaii, and I met the Polestar band, who you see pictured here. There's a picture I took at their Sacred Music Festival, playing, as you see here, several instruments as a form of sacred devotional music. And I really wanted to understand, at a certain point then, how did this band come together to have these instruments, including the ukulele, which clearly is not an instrument from India or from South Asia, and is clearly new in terms of the repertoire or the ensemble of practices and instruments that are being used. I was particularly inspired during this time by the field of Indian Ocean studies, and you see this book here, Reimagining Indian Ocean Worlds. This is a book that was published in a graduate and postgraduate even consortium of scholars at UC Davis who were studying the Indian Ocean studies together, and really trying to understand the way that the Indian Ocean has pushed its boundaries and influenced the region of the Indian Ocean into other oceanic regions. There's been subsequent scholarship that's come out, for example, by Byron Sykes, that has identified something what they call an Indian Ocean ethnomusicology, meaning how does Indian Ocean cultural practices, for example, musical practices, connect with other regions? How does it even go beyond the Indian Ocean? And really what I'm trying to show here is that the story I'm about to tell you within this Indian Ocean ethnomusicology really connects the world's three major oceans together. The Indian Ocean, okay, which you see a picture of here, which is what Indian Ocean studies has typically been focused on, but also the Atlantic. We'll see the Atlantic Ocean coming in here, stories of the Atlantic Ocean, and the Pacific Ocean. These three oceanic worlds are going to be giving each other influence through oceanic routes, through which instruments and people and their music traveled and finally connect to give you what you're seeing over there, which is the Kirtan practice that's being done in conjunction with meditation at Polestar Gardens. So Yogananda, Paramahansa Yogananda, upon whom this community is founded, their guru, is a really interesting case study. And I say that because he has inspired so many people to meditate all over the world. Even after I left here, or when I left California and Hawaii and moved to Switzerland, I found the Yogananda community there, and I've meditated with them there. And the experience is very similar, whether I'm in Southern California, at the SRF, or at Polestar Gardens, or in Zürich. There's a very kind of basic formula to it, at least. And a big part of that is how Yogananda got them to chant and sing before they meditated. Okay, so there's this practice of chanting and singing as part of the preparation, perhaps you could say, to enter into a deeper kind of meditation that anyone can do, and then which you could also be initiated into later if you wanted to go further. So Yogananda, who you see standing here in the early 20th century, in the middle underneath the red arrow, is coming out of a lineage of what's called kriya yoga, and you can see on the bottom there the lineage holders of that tradition. I won't go through all of them now, but you will notice that Jesus is there. So Jesus was part of his lineage, and then the other gurus there, in whose lineage Yogananda is, who's then taking it out of South Asia and bringing it to America in specific. So while Yogananda is doing this in the early 20th century, one of the interesting things to note is that he's part of a bigger movement of the Indian cultural arts that are encountering Europe and in dialogue with Europe. And some of the main players in this, some of you may be familiar with some of these people, but Rukmini Devi, for example, who was born a South Indian Brahmin, but also married someone from England who was a member of the Theosophical Society. And she became a part of the Theosophical Society, which was a broader transnational movement that was really interested in mysticism and comparative religion, among other things. And Rukmini Devi is known for, in studies, in performance studies and South Asian studies, for being a sort of high caste person who reforms low caste practices from the Devadasis, the temple dancers, and makes them respectable for middle and high class society globally. Okay. The second person that you see here is Swami Paramahansa, who's famous for taking what were considered to be sort of primitive and degenerative hatha yoga practices, the bodily practices that we commonly encounter with, like doing breathing exercises and stretches and things like that, that had been kind of deemed as primitive in India by the British. He started subjecting those practices to science to show his global audiences that, look, yoga does something to you, something transformative, or it has some measurable effect. Okay. The third person you see here is Dvaram Naidu, who is a Carnatic violin player who brought, among other people, brought the violin into Carnatic music, a Western instrument, because, as other scholars have shown, like Amanda Weidman, it was an instrument that could replicate the voice in Carnatic music so well that it easily came into this system of practice, Carnatic music. Now, this process has been kind of critically studied within the field of South Asian studies and religious studies as promoting a kind of high caste project, attempting to take Indian arts and make them, again, respectable to the world, and to erase from these practices anything kind of grotesque or primitive or, you know, unseemly according to Victorian Protestant and sort of Christian ethos, right? So what is happening here is what many scholars have labeled as sanitization or deodorization of these practices. For example, when you see that Utkatasana, the chair pose, is no longer being used to administer an enema, but is actually a healthy form of exercise, you can see that something has shifted there, right? They've gotten rid of the enema, but they've kept the pose in transnational yoga. Why? Well, they're using it for something else. It's been made more respectable in the eyes of global society. So really what's happening here, there is a caste level to this. There's a level of Brahmin co-optation of lower caste practices, cleaning them up, and then making them respectable for global society. And I like to think of it instead of a sanitization process or deodorization process, of just cleaning up these seemingly primitive practices and making them palatable for a Western audience, really, is what they were doing. I prefer to use this notion of cross-cultural communication. They were trying to communicate from the middle class to the middle class, or you could say the upper class and the middle class across to the other uppers and middle class around the world, particular cultural logics that they felt were worthy of sharing with the world, okay? And so I want to show why this is through a particular instantiation of this from my ethnographic experiences of being at Polestar and then subsequently looking a little bit closer at Yogananda's music and the history of Paramahansa Yogananda's music to show how he fits into this process in a very particular way. And his legacy has been so long lasting all the way into the present that I think, and understudied in terms of these musical contributions to yoga and to music in general, that I think they're worth our consideration. And this brings us to Polestar Gardens. So you see in the background of this image here, the temple at Polestar Gardens in Hawaii. And I should mention now that in 2018, right after we left, we were there for 6 months in 2017, the Kilauea volcano started erupting. Some of you may have seen this on the news. It was all over the world. And it actually sadly destroyed the community and the community house. And they've since moved to Fort Collins, Colorado, and have a really beautiful piece of land and community there now. And so if anyone's interested in checking them out, I'll show that on the last slide, the website, so you can see what they look like now. But they're reestablishing the community now in Colorado, in Fort Collins, Colorado. The story I'm going to tell you now is what we experienced in 2017 in the Puna district on the Big Island of Hawaii, where my wife and I went and spent a lot of time listening and participating and meditating and doing all sorts of fun things at this community, and where I learned quite a bit about Yogananda and his music. So just to give you a little background on this Puna district that I'm showing you here, 1848, there's 3 important dates here that I want you to see. 1848 was a date when Calvinist missionaries who were in Hawaii privatized the land in an event that was known as the Great Divide, the Mahele, and it divided Hawaiian land and privatized it and overthrew the old indigenous Ahupua'a system, which was a system of land management that was not privatized like we think of private land now, right? So that was thrown out. It privatized land and it opened up the land to be able to be owned by people, and it was eventually subdivided. In 1898, the US government overthrew the Hawaiian kingdom, and in 1958 then took Hawaii as a state, right? They annexed Hawaii and made it an official state. So throughout this period, what happened in the Puna district specifically is it was subdivided into very cheap land in a very beautiful area. And it has since become, if anybody's ever been to the Big Island, if you haven't, I recommend you go here. It's a hotspot for these communities we were talking about, these yoga communities, these intentional communities. There's any intentional community you want to find, you can find it in the Puna district of Hawaii. So it's really important from a kind of historical and ethnographic perspective to consider how this space has been shaped, and now being subdivided and being the most, I think, relatively affordable land in the state of Hawaii. It's a place where, in big swaths of agricultural land, that these communities end up coming, and it's absolutely a beautiful place. So what I want to show here is, as I go through this at the community, is that chanting has both spiritual and social implications. Spiritual, according to this Kriya yoga system, the initiatory program I told you about, but the initial phases of that. And then there's also social implications to what chanting does to a community when you live in intentional community. What I really want to emphasize here is a relational approach following van der Linden, who's written a really interesting book about the history of the social history of late colonial music that really recovers Indian agency, so Yogananda's agency, in the making of this music and the system and bringing it to America in a way that it has been able to sustain itself and still, as I'll argue and show, remain committed to this much older musicology and yoga system that, though it has changed, the instruments have changed, there's songs that have been added, nevertheless, it's still intended to kind of have the same yogic outcome, if you want to put it that way. So from an anthropological perspective, what I'm trying to do here is balance these emic and emic frameworks, insider outsider perspectives, my analytical framework with what the community is trying to accomplish in the community itself with this yoga. So there's so much I can say about the yoga there at Polestar, but this is what we learned as the daily meditation exercises, and this is what we did most every day. We would wake up in the morning, and we meditated usually 3 times per day, once in the morning for about an hour, preceded by the energization exercises you see here, once before lunch and then once before dinner. And when you meditate over a long period of time, and there's plenty of scientific studies that say yoga does this and meditation does that, it definitely has a transformative effect on you, right? It has biological and psychological effects, as we might guess. This particular meditation system starts with, as you see up here, the energization exercises, which you see on the top left there, where you move the body in various ways to really learn how to control the energy in your body. And I have to say that when you do those over a long period of time, even just the energization exercises, it's really shocking how you find out just how much you can control things, processes you can control in your body that you didn't know you could control before, with your muscles, muscle contractions, and various things. So these exercises are learned and done 2 times a day before meditation to kind of, one, prepare the body for meditation, and also to give one a sense of that kind of control over the energy that travels through the body. Really fascinating. The second thing, and this is the thing I'm going to focus on here, is chanting aloud, or kirtan. Many of us have heard of this in Sanskrit. It's kirtana, which I've underscored from the Mona Williams Sanskrit Dictionary, from the verbal root kirt, which can mean to name, to call, to recite, to repeat, to relate, to communicate, to praise, to glorify. This is music used to praise and glorify and call the name of the divine. Okay, and that's what we're going to hear today, and that's what we were doing there. So we would do these energization exercises. We would go into the temple. We would chant for a while, and then we would start doing breathing techniques. It's called the Hong Sa technique. You probably heard of pranayama or yogic breath control. It's a kind of pranayama technique. And then the last thing we would do, for people who have been meditating for a long time, is do what's known as the Om technique. The Om technique, which is the final picture you see down here, where someone is performing a mudra to cover all the senses, a hand gesture to cover all the senses, to listen for an internal unstruck sound within oneself. And this is a theme that comes up in a lot of yoga texts. Listening for a sound within yourself that's emanating on its own, unstruck, uncreated. And that sound in this tradition is Om. You've probably heard Om in yoga studios. Om is a very popular, or if not the most popular mantra in South Asian philosophy, right? So this is the daily meditation. We do it 3 times a day. One of the things I think from a social perspective that this meditation does is that it creates a controlled space for emotional regulation. And I remember being in a study session there with Michael Gornik, the co-founder, when he ran his weekly philosophy session. He said, "Chris, do you know this word, titiksha, in Sanskrit?" And I hadn't heard it before, and I was like, "No, but it sounds really cool." So I went and looked it up. And it basically means, emotional imperturbability. Like through yoga practice and through the spiritual practices and all the things we're doing, you're building up a sense of emotional regulation and not allowing yourself to be disturbed by what's going on around you amidst the we could say chaos of everyday life, right? And that's why most people go to yoga in the first place, right? In order to be able to emotionally regulate, recover from the stress, and so on and so forth. Now, you can imagine living in an intentional yoga community that there's a lot going on. There's a lot, I can tell you just from showing you these pictures here, we worked really hard when we were there in the mornings, and then in the afternoons we had off, which was really nice. But we worked really hard because, someone has to clean, we got to pick weeds, we got to grow food. There's the permaculture garden you see there, build things. Polestar's really into doing some pretty amazing construction projects. There was always work to be done, as there is anywhere in life. But when you're doing it in such close quarters with so many different people, there can be frictions in any community. And having lived in several of the communities in this area during my life, I can tell you that it happens everywhere, right? Polestar had a particular way of this, or I should say Polestar's music and Polestar's meditation, from my experience, and I think the experience of other people that I spoke to there, has this effect of helping you kind of have that inner peace amidst the chaos of intentional living, that emotional regulation, of course, right? We would expect that amidst all the work, but it was like a very cathartic experience to chant and call the divine names as we would do, and then to go into meditation, do pranayama and all these things. It was really quite a powerful experience. So you can see here there's also a social dimension to what kirtan does in a community socially. What I want to show you now, and tell the story I want to tell you now, is how 2 particular instruments came into this kirtan community. And this is the ukulele. the small 4-string guitar that you saw before, and the harmonium. I was surprised, not by the harmonium, because we've probably all seen the harmonium before, we associate it with yoga practice, most practitioners do. But when I saw them playing the ukulele and I listened to the ukulele, it was a surprise for me, because I'm used to it just being this fun Hawaiian instrument that you play and you listen to, and that's my social conditioning, that's what I think about it. But I found it actually also quite powerful in the kirtan itself, in the way that it kind of moved people in the audience into a place where they were ready for meditation. And so I started to ask these questions of how could that be? How could it arrive there? And so what I want to show you right now is the social life of both of these instruments, and particularly the ukulele, following Bates, to look at the way that instruments can move across spaces, cultural spaces, and be incorporated into new cultural logics. And in this case, it's the chanting that prepares you to go into meditation, the kirtan. What I find interesting about these two instruments is that they have parallel colonial histories. I'm going to show you those. What I want to show you really quickly are two videos here. One where the ukulele is being used on Wednesday night at a famous event in the area called Uncle Robert's, where people go to listen, have a drink, eat, dance. And then the other is Michael and other people in the Polestar Music Band playing the harmonium and the ukulele together. These are happening at the same time on Wednesday night, right? Because it always both of these events happened on Wednesday night. You're either at one or the other. And if you're at Polestar, hopefully you're at meditation, right? We used to joke about that. But the point is that they're being used. You can see the ukulele is being used in two very distinct ways here. And then here's Kirtan at Polestar with the ukulele. It's the red arrows you see are the ukuleles. You also hear a violin. Someone had brought that week. It didn't happen all the time, but sometimes it did. But you see this really interesting mix of instruments coming together. My question then became like, how does this happen, and how does this carry forward this ancient tradition of kriya yoga? I started looking at the social lives of these instruments. So we begin with the harmonium, for example. This is probably a little bit better known history than the ukulele, because a lot of yoga practitioners are interested about where does the harmonium come from? As you can see here, it was patented in Paris in 1842 as an upright foot-pumped organ. It looks something like that on the left. But it was used also even before this by missionaries from Europe who had come to India, Christian missionaries, as part of the overall conversion of people within India. What happens in 1913, however, is Dwarkanath Ghose creates an Indian sitting hand pump model, the one that you see Yogananda with in this picture in 1913. Okay, so cut the legs off. In India, they play a lot of music on the ground, sitting on the ground, right? Across, like we were talking about this earlier, how Westerners don't like to squat and drink chai, but we do, right? I mean, people in India do. We use our bodies differently, and so this Indian Ghose makes the harmonium India's own, right? So that's the one you see there. And then, of course, it goes all over the place. And what happens there with the harmonium, the hand pump model, is questions start to come up about Indian authenticity in Indian music, right? Is it an authentic thing to use? A lot of Indians rejected it. It was in fact banned on All India radio for a time by a member of the Theosophical Society who was working for them, because it wasn't considered to be quote unquote authentic enough to carry forward Indian music. Other people, including Yogananda, however, took it up, Sikhs took it up, a lot of people took it up and said, no, it is totally authentic. And oftentimes what was interesting, if you read the work of Van der Linden, who I mentioned earlier, you'll actually see that the same people who are saying it's inauthentic can also be found using it, because it's such an easy thing to learn an easy thing to tune, an easy thing to travel with, and it's very durable and easy to fix. Okay, those are some of the high qualities of this instrument, and it produces a nice sound. I found it quite lovely. For example, when we were doing Kirtan at Polestar. The other more interesting thing to me, though, is how the ukulele was finding its way into this story. And so here, I want you to look at these pictures here and decide which of these two instruments is the ukulele and which of these two pictures is Hawaii, right? You have to look at that for a second and ask yourself. They look very similar, right? That's the point I'm trying to make. And what you're seeing here essentially is the ukulele. This is the Hawaiian coast. This is a very interesting book about the ukulele where I found this information. It was quite happy to find. But on the left, what you see is the machete, which is a Portuguese instrument that came from the subtropical island of Madeira, which is what you see right here. This is Madeira. And this is an image from the early 19th century of this instrument being played on the left and right there. You see a violin in the middle in Madeira by Portuguese, okay, who were on the island. What were they doing there? In Madeira, they were growing sugarcane. They were growing, there's really good wine in Madeira. I'm sure some of us have heard of this island. It's off the coast of Morocco, Africa, but it belongs to the Portuguese. It used to belong to the British. Well, what happened is in 1879, the machete, the one you see on the left here, arrives to Hawaii for the first time in the hands of sugarcane workers who were fleeing a food shortage in Madeira. And what also happened was a German who was living in Hawaii was contracted with going to Europe to find people, to find laborers to bring over to Hawaii because there was a profitable sugarcane industry established there in the islands. And so what ends up happening is all these Madeiran Portuguese come with their ukuleles, what are at the time machetes, or machete, and in 1879, one of them steps off the boat. This is the first recorded historical time that it was ever seen. He gets off the boat. They had just made a 4-month voyage from the Atlantic Ocean. They're totally exhausted. They're totally hungry. Some of them are sick. And he's so happy and he's so grateful to be there that he just starts playing the thing out there for fun. And the Hawaiians are so impressed by it that within a decade, it becomes a national instrument of Hawaii. So by the time you hit the year 1900, everybody knows what ukulele is. They renamed it ukulele, which means a bouncing flea. It was a flea that had also come over on boats because of the way that the fingers bounced around on the instrument when the people from Madeira were playing it. So they took it, and then the Hawaiians made that instrument their own. Okay, you can see there, they make the instrument their own, and this is what it looks like today. But its origins, of course, were here in Madeira. So what's the conceptual link that allows all of this to happen? As I looked back to try to find out what's going on in Kriya Yoga and how is it possible for this ukulele to join the harmonium, the violin, and all these other things in this space? How can this happen and still be called Kriya Yoga? It's so new, and yet it's, I'm being taught that it's so old. And the conceptual link that I found was in Shangadeva's text, Sangita Ratnakara, when I was reading a book by Vilke and Moivas about the history. It's a book-length chapter about the history of what's known as Nada Brahman, which you see here. And what this text is essentially saying, and what Shangadeva is saying, is that sound, music, and instruments of any kind, any music, which is nada, that's the nada, any music or instrument, can, by virtue of just being so captivating, take you to Brahman, which is God, the absolute in this tradition, right? So the musicology here is basically, it's very tantric. It's very much about the senses. It's very much about listening and enjoying music, right? And sacred devotional music, but really any kind of music. And in listening to that external sound, that beautiful music of any kind, you are then led to, or can potentially connect to, an internal unstruck sound within you. Okay, so the sound that you're hearing, the audible sacred sound you're hearing, is connected to an unstruck sound. Again, in the tradition of Yogananda, that's the sound of Om. And that experience would be considered sort of one of the apex, pinnacle, transcendent experiences in the South Asian yoga tradition of Kriya Yoga, okay? So why does that matter? So I've already explained that. It matters because the Radha-Swamis, which is a movement from the late 19th century or the mid 19th century, you could say, took this musicology that was directly linked back to what I just explained to you, the Nada Brahman in Shangadeva. They're taking this musicology of connecting external sound to internal unstruck sound, and they're developing it even more in India at the time, okay? And they're drawing from many religious traditions, and many religious traditions are drawing from this musicology, you could say. It was a very influential musicology. The key thing with the Radha-Swamis is that their sacred music, which is called bhajan, which is like Kirtan, where they're using instruments to make this beautiful sacred music, was linked to the practice of listening, once again, to an inward unstruck sound. And this is important because Yogananda first learned the meditation techniques of the Radha-Swamis, okay, movement when he was young, when he was very young. Their meditation focuses on listening for the inner sound of Om and attempting to see an inner divine light. So he learned it from them when he was young, this practice of listening for an inner sound of Om when this music is being used in conjunction with it, as I just showed you. And then, as one of his biographers says, in later life, he held this experience of sound and light as complementary to Kriya Yoga. So Kriya Yoga is his whole system, but this has been kind of complementary to it, and this is what I experienced. When I read this, I said, yes, this is what I'm experiencing at Polestar. It's like there's this Kriya Yoga system, initiatory system of meditation, but music is this kind of unstruck or a struck sound that pulls people in, and it would literally draw people in from all over the area in Pune. As I said, on Wednesday night, there's 2 events you could go to. You could go dance and drink kava at Uncle Robert's, the place I showed you where they're doing hula, or this kirtan was going on at Polestar Gardens. And in that kirtan, the music was, I mean, it was, for some people, it was the highlight of their week to go in and listen to this music. It's this captivation of music that then would end in a meditation every time, okay? So this is why Yogananda said, and Yogananda's been quoted for this, and it's in Cosmic Chants, chanting is half the battle. Chanting in this devotional kirtan is half the battle. So what this means, if we look at Shangadeva's earlier musicology, is that struck sound in kirtan, when I say struck, sound you can hear that's struck on instruments, leads a practitioner to an experience of an unstruck sound in meditation. And this is really where Yogananda was trying to take people. And when there's all these famous stories of him singing with people and chanting with people. One of the ones they told a lot of Polestar is when he showed up at Carnegie Hall in 1926, he chanted this song, "Oh God, Beautiful," over and over and over again for almost 90 minutes with the audience. These are, Christian Americans. These are not people in South Asia who would know about this, but it would captivate them, and they would tell stories about it, how it transformed them, and they would have all these really transformative experiences. So I think that kind of musicology, the theology of sound that Yogananda is trying to bring to America, he's doing it, he's using the music, he's using the sound in a way where he's meeting Americans where they are, right? With the instruments they know, with the songs they know, with the language they know. But it's really a kind of first step to bring them in, to sit a little longer, listen a little longer, and have an experience of this transcendent experience that the Kriya Yoga system is said to lead to, which would be an experience of your higher self or Brahman or the absolute or God or however divine. Okay. Now this last slide, before I turn it over to Polestar, is meant to be really messy and show you what I think is the whole story I'm trying to tell you here. If you look at the red lines here, these red lines are really showing the influence from South Asia specifically that had influenced Yogananda, right? So he was influenced obviously by this movement in the cultural arts to make the cultural arts available to global audiences, and particularly here for him it would be in America. He's bringing it from the Indian Ocean, from his own Indian Ocean region, where it's being shaped in the crucible of colonialism. At the same time, he's influenced by this Kriya Yoga tradition that shows you how to meditate and focus on this internal sound, which is itself influenced by the Radha-Swamis and musicology from the 13th century. All these influences are already in Yogananda before he even leaves, and many more. These aren't his only influences, but these very distinctly South Asian cultural logics are part of who he is. but he also studied Christian theology, and he also went to Christian school. So he knew his Western audience as well, right? The other thing that's happening from the Atlantic Ocean is we're getting the harmonium, right? The harmonium is coming, and not only that, more specifically from Madeira, we're getting this instrument, the machete, which becomes the ukulele, becomes very much a part of Hawaiian culture. But when Puna has created this situation where intentional communities are sort of open and able to settle down there, that ukulele is coming then into the Kirtan practice of the community itself, who are working and toiling together and using this meditation for spiritual and social purposes to kind of advance on that path towards listening for the unstruck sound, and eventually always ending in silent meditation, as you see at the very top of the image here. So again, the music would end in a silent meditation, and for those who are a little bit more advanced, listening for an unstruck sound within. And I put a question mark at the top because you see all these blue arrows going up. This is kind of like the internal cultural logic that Yogananda is trying to bring to America, and that has come into this community, is manifesting in a very particular place in a very particular way with all these very particular social histories, and yet is meant to lead you to something that transcends all of that social history and all of the social stuff that's happening on the ground, right? It's like a constant human desire to kind of push beyond the boundaries of the limits of human nature in some ways. And I also put the question mark there because, as I mentioned, Polestar now has moved to Fort Collins because the community property was destroyed by the volcano. They have a beautiful new property there. And so I now wonder, I haven't been there yet. I really want to go next time I'm in the US to see like, now what's happening, right? And there are a lot of really interesting things happening there. I recommend people go to their website and see what they're doing, but the way that they're governing the new place, where it's situated socially and historically in Fort Collins on this biodynamic farm, and all the interesting things that leads to. So now I have the questions of like, now where does this go, right? What more social combinations can we see kind of coming together here in this experience? So with that being said, I'm going to turn it over to Polestar Village, and you can go to their website, again, there it is there, to bring to us an experience of the music that I'm talking about, the harmonium and the ukulele, so you can hear it. And so they're going to be with us for about, get the hit escape. They're going to be with us and let us listen and also meditate a little bit on what that means. So I'd like to introduce you to Michael Gornik, the co-founder there, and longtime community member Vina Ketty, who joined us from Fort Collins, Colorado. Welcome, Michael and Vina, and thank you so much for being here with us. Let's see, we can't hear you yet, but.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for inviting us to join today. Chris, that was very, very fascinating and uplifting talk. Thank you so much. So we're going to play a couple of chants and then have a little meditation together. And as Chris said, the music is designed to draw you into a deeper and deeper experience of yourself, really, of your true self. So this first one is a Hawaiian chant we've come to love. It has both a Hawaiian verse and an English verse. And I'll say the words because if you can sing along, and if you're muted, which I think everybody is, you're welcome to sing along. You can't really sing together online, as you may know, because of the lag time. But if you're muted, you can sing right along with Vina and I. The words are E malama I ka heiau. E malama pono I ka heiau. And the very liberal English version is earth and sky, sea and stone, hold this land in sacredness. next chant is a chant by Yogananda. Listen, listen, listen to my heart song. I will never forget thee. I will never forsake thee. Listen, listen, listen to my heart song. Listen, listen, listen to my heart song. I will never forget thee. I will never forsake thee. I will never forget thee. I will never forsake thee. Listen, listen, listen to my heart song. Listen, listen, listen to my heart song. I will never forget thee. I will never forsake thee. I will never forget thee. I will never forsake thee. Listen, listen, listen to my heart song. Listen, listen, listen to my heart song. I will never forget thee. I will never forsake thee. Listen, listen, listen to my heart song. Listen, listen, listen to my heart song. I will never forget thee. I will never forsake thee. I will never forget thee. I will never forsake thee. I will never forget thee. I will never forsake thee. I will never forget thee. I will never forsake thee. Listen, listen, listen to my heart song. Listen, listen, listen to my heart song. Oh, listen, listen, listen to my heart song. Listen, listen, listen to my heart song. I will never forget thee. I will never forsake thee. I will never forget thee. I will never forsake thee. Listen, listen, listen to my heart song. 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 Let's meditate briefly. Sitting up straight, with eyes closed. We start with relaxation, so quickly scan the body for any tension, the feet and the legs, hips, groin. Just let go of all tension there, the hands, arms, abdomen, chest, and back. Consciously relax your face, your eyes, your tongue, your whole head. Now that your body is relaxed, consciously relax your mental body. Letting go all tension, all strain, any concerns about the past or the future. Allowing yourself to become completely present, completely awake and aware in this moment. With eyes closed, gently lift your gaze upward and slightly inward to the point between the eyebrows. This is the seat of spiritual perception, spiritual eye. With your attention focused there, draw your attention to the natural flow of your breath. Observing this miracle of life, flowing in, flowing out. Just witnessing the process. For just a few moments more now, continue in that concentration upon the natural flow of breath. The moment you notice your mind is wandering, just bring it back, observing with interest each inhalation, each exhalation. And now letting go of that practice, just relax completely with the gaze lifted. Try to absorb and receive the effects of your brief meditation. We'll close our practice by just chanting Om together 3 times. You're welcome to join me. It's going to be a way of just dissolving further into that unstruck sound. And also be a way of sharing this, the blessings of your meditation with others. So you can visualize as you chant Om, the energy, the peace, calmness you received in meditation, spreading out in all directions, blessing all beings.
Thank you both. It's nice after talking for 40 minutes to sit and listen to Polestar music and have a little meditation. So thank you very much for joining us to do that. I will just say we're probably going to go into a little bit of Q&A, right? Before we start what I want to say at the beginning is I wanted to make scholars practitioners for a moment and make practitioners scholars for a moment. So I know that we have a mixed audience here. We have, and for me, I think the lines between those things, when you're doing ethnographic field work of any kind, start to blur a little bit, right? So that's why I really wanted to incorporate this music and meditation to give us a feeling of what was happening 3 times a day at Polestar. So thank you for doing that. Really.
Yeah, that was really quite unique for us as well. So thank you so very, very much. Moving to the Q&A, what you guys online can do is type your questions in the chat, and we'll have a look at that. While you guys type, I'm first going to direct my attention to the people in the room. Questions, comments, interrogations for Professor Mill.
I can make myself enough clear. I was curious, because as you mentioned, Yogananda, I mean, also what we heard, he wrote some of these kirtans in English. Although, of course, I don't know at all of them, then I would ask myself, but how are they different from songs people sing in church? If they're English, I mean, even if you call God, God, I mean, and is it only the name Kirtan, which is Indian, let's say? I mean, what's Indian about that? Because you also mentioned this, at the beginning, and correct me if I got it wrong, the Indian agency from Yogananda, but I mean, did he reflect about his identity in his writings as an Indian or not? Or, because, it struck me a bit.
Yeah, no, thank you for both questions. So to answer the second question, yes, I think he really did write about it. Like if you read Autobiography of a Yogi, has everybody read that before? This book, his autobiography.
Yeah.
He talks a lot about his Indian identity, but already his Indian identity is already, you can see, and my colleague Anya Foxon has written about this, for example, it's already influenced by things that are very much of his time, the colonial moment, so to speak, right? So he does speak very much in identifying with his Indian identity, certainly, from a religious and also, I think, cultural perspective. When you read the autobiography, you hear a lot about being Indian, I guess you could say, right? The second question about what's Indian about the music, right? This is also a good question. And if you read Vilke and Moibus's story or book length chapter from which I was drawing the musicology from, that's really well written. What I think Yogananda is doing is, according to that musicology, is he's taking it a further step, right? Because in the Sangita Ratnakara, they're not thinking about church music in America as belonging to that.
Did you read this Sangita Ratnakara?
No.
Was he conversant?
No. Yogananda, as far as I know, was not conversant in it, but the things he was saying were very much in line with the musicology that is in there, which had directly influenced the Radha Swamis, who he learned this from first, so to speak. So the Radha Swamis, according to Vilke and Moibus, I'm drawing from a lot of secondary scholarship on the musicology, they were directly influenced by this musicology, as were many other musicians and groups, and it wasn't just them in South Asia. So Yogananda had the influence in a direct way through them, which then he coupled to his Kriya Yoga practice, right? And then took it abroad. And then what Yogananda does, I think, is take it to the next step. And there's a fluidity here, because he then, when he shows up in Carnegie Hall in 1926 and starts chanting, "Oh God, Beautiful," which is an English translation of a Sikh chant, he's chanting something in a language. He's able to get the Americans to understand it because he's using the word God, right? But he's taking that musicology that says you can use any instrument, any voice, any music, and he's taking it to the next step to say like, and this music also counts. Does that make sense? So it's an elaboration on what he's learned from the Radha Swamis. It's an elaboration in an American context, and it's turning into something new at the same time, right? And this is why I was talking about continuities and discontinuities at the beginning. It starts to get kind of blurry about what is South Asian and what is American, so to speak, or not South Asian. I think the two are very intimately entangled in a way that makes it difficult to peel the two apart, so to speak. It's a kind of cultural combination entanglement that's taking place there. In my book, what I'm looking at is how these supposed universals, so yoga, people who teach yoga who are coming from South Asia claim to have this kind of universal practice that anyone can do. Well, what does that mean, right? What does it mean if someone's playing an ukulele? It's still a universal practice? And my argument in the book is, I think so. It's still according to Yogananda's original, ideas and his lineage's ideas. It's just an elaboration on that idea, and it's turning into something new at the same time. So, does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks for the question.
Thank you.
Yeah, if I'm not wrong, I have seen that Jesus was a part of the lineage in Yogananda, right? And how is it included in this particular type of yoga, the image of Jesus? It's quite interesting to know about.
Chris, could you paraphrase the question first so people might?
Yeah, and maybe I would if Michael wants to respond to that question.
But you're gonna have to repeat it.
I will repeat it for you. The question is Jesus is in Yogananda's lineage, right? And how did that come to be? What is his place in the lineage? Michael, would you like to tell us?
Oh, sure. I'll give it a shot. Yogananda felt like his essential mission in traveling to the West was to show the underlying unity between Eastern and Western approaches to spirituality. So that's one answer, that he really felt that the universality of West and East needs to be emphasized right now. And then secondarily, in his deep meditations and spiritual experiences, he felt and had visions of Christ and felt a great attunement with that particular prophet and expression of divinity. So both those, I think, are good reasons.
Thank you, Michael. Yes, if you read like the autobiography, his autobiography, you will find him talking about these experiences with Jesus and other writings too. I don't remember exactly where they are, what Michael's referring to though, but is that he in some ways sees himself as another incarnation of this Christ consciousness, they might call it, right, Michael? So from an emic perspective, it's like a continuation of this universal Christ consciousness. From a kind of edict analytical perspective, when you look at it, you look at the history. First of all, Yogananda studied Christian theology, and in a Christian theological school was where he got his bachelor's degree, right? So he knows a lot about the Bible and about Christianity, and so does his guru, Sri Yukteswar, knew a lot about Christianity. Wrote a book called The Holy Science, which is also another popular book you can read in this lineage. So there's they know the Christian theology, and really like what's happening, and other scholars have written about this, like Lola Williamson, is that Yogananda is in this Advaita Vedanta framework where he can accept all of the world's religions. It's accommodating enough, the way it's being portrayed, Advaita Vedanta, to be able to accommodate not only any South Asian religious tradition or god or goddess into its fold, but also any religion really. And so Christianity becomes, it finds a place, it's accommodated within this broader Vedantic system that Yogananda is part of. And Jesus can take a place at the altar, so to speak, without there being any friction. It's not difficult. Well, it might be difficult for Christians to admit a guru, say, into a Christian context. For for someone in the Advaita Vedanta context, it's easier and there's more accommodating system to be able to bring in, say, Jesus from the West, and not have to sacrifice your commitment to the overall goals of the system, right? So Jesus becomes part of the lineage, so to speak. And you see, so it's kind of taking it's really interesting. It's taking the religion of empire and it's putting it into your own lineage, in a sense, right? Making it your own. Yeah.
Yeah, and also Michael G. So in his autobiography of the Yogi book, he actually gave us the narrative of his embodied experience with Mahavata Babaji. So is Jesus, I mean, in a picture or in his idea related to that idea of Mahavata Babaji? Mahavata came to this realm, the human realm, from time to time, and Jesus was one of them. Is there any narratives like that? So this is the first question. Second question is, so from his book we can see, so he went to that cave, and he meditated over there, slept in that cave. Actually, I went to that cave somewhere in Uttarakhand, and it was not easy to find that cave. He slept over there, meditated over there, and he saw Mahavata Babaji. So that is his story, and also we got Swami Vivekananda's story. Swami Vivekananda's story was he went to those places here and there scattered in the Himalayas, like Mayavati Ashram, and also Kesadevi Mandi near Amora. So actually, I could say some embodiments of those things. They use their own body, or they use their own travels and methods to securitize
The place.
The Himalayas.
Yeah.
And later on, of course, in this era, we could say, and of course, before this, I would like to mention, so those yoga community members or hippies, after they read the stories of Yogananda, and also heard the stories of Swami Vivekananda, they went to the Himalayas, Indian Himalayas, one after another. But in this era, we could say from the Indian tourism promotional video clips, somehow they didn't chase away that idea. However, they inherited that idea. They hired the Westerners to say, the Himalayas, or India is the place of yoga, and so on and so forth. So I could say there's a coloniality and counter-coloniality, or coloniality invaded with yoga modernity.
Chris, I guess I'm going to ask you to paraphrase those questions.
Yeah, no, so the first question is fundamentally, and Michael can chime in on this one too. The first question is what is Yogananda's relationship essentially to Babaji, right? And the second question has to do with the fact that Yogananda, among many other yogis during this time and before, traveled, like Vivekananda, traveled to certain places, caves, temples, sacred places in the landscape, and in doing so have kind of infused those places with some kind of sacred meaning, especially for people who follow them, right? And that is now intersected with tourism, like go to Rishikesh or any of these places where Shivananda was. It happens with a lot of gurus. So the second question, I think, is yes. I mean, when you have these places that sacred figures have visited, it becomes easier, of course, to create a pilgrimage site around them. We see that also in our Jain studies, for example, where people have performed Salekana, the ritual fast to death. Those places become, those mountains become imbued with sacred meaning. They become pilgrimage sites, right? So yes, you can do a Yogananda you can go to India and do a Yogananda pilgrimage, and you can see all these sacred sites. And then, of course, that intersects with the politics of yoga and the government in India, and all these things come together because yoga is being promoted as a form of, as I've written about this elsewhere, soft power on the international stage to really draw people in, right? So yeah, it makes sense. I mean, they put Yogananda on a stamp, right? They've done a lot of things that happen like this, of course. To the second question, Michael, I don't know if you want to say on Yogananda's relationship to Babaji.
Okay. Yeah, just briefly. Babaji was Yogananda's what they call Param Guru, which is like great grandfather guru. It's his guru's guru. So that is a very direct part of his lineage. Whereas I think he included both Jesus Christ and Krishna more in a cultural sense because of their representations of East and West, where Babaji was a more direct transmission, I guess I would put it.
So beside Maharata Babaji, there is another Babaji temple, ashram. Just give me a second.
There are many. I mean, I think there are many Babaji lineages, right? I remember being in Pune on the Big Island, and I was meeting people who followed Babaji. I was like, is it the same Babaji as the Yogananda Babaji? And so you could see, like, in this space where all these communities are living, there are even multiple interpretations of who Babaji was outside of the Yogananda lineage, so to speak.
And the story is more or less the same.
The same, or there were variations on the story, which would be an interesting ethnography of it on the many lives of who people think Babaji is, right? But within Polestar, I think they follow closely to what Yogananda would have said in the SRF, right, in terms of his placement in that lineage as the guru of Lahiri Mahashaya, who's the guru of Sri Yukteswar, who's the guru of Yogananda.
Yeah, I found it. So not far from the water compound of Ranikhet, there is a Hidakan Babaji. So the story of that Hidakan Babaji is more or less the same as what the Yogananda described about the Mahabharata Babaji in the book.
Cool.
Great. Meanwhile, hello. Here I am at the corner of your screen. There's two questions in the chat, but they are very conveniently rather close to each other. So it's Eva asks whether there's any engagement from people in India with this type of global yoga, like the Polestar community, what they think about this form of the Kirtans, do they have an opinion? And then there's Dieter, who thanks you for the talk, and then asks you to elaborate on the audience for this type of practice. Yep. Ethnicity, background, South Asian diaspora, question mark. So maybe you can sort of slide those into each other and tell us some more about the audience, both audience, and then maybe practitioner audience for this type of practice.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, this is a great kind of like real ethnographic question about who I encountered as I moved around. So let me start at the beginning, and I'll tell you who I've experienced in these communities. I started working as a business manager in an intentional community down the road from Polestar in 2013. And I heard about their Kalani, who Michael and Vina know. I heard about this thing, this Maha Kirtan thing that was going on, our sacred music festival down the road. And someone, my friend Karen actually at Kalani, drove me in a bus, one of the buses down the road in Pune to the sacred music festival. And I showed up there and I was sort of struck by the audience was pretty, I would say, fairly diverse in that this area draws people, a lot of people from like the white middle class who would tend to search for living off the grid in paradise, right? But at the Polestar community, it was fairly diverse, middle class practitioners, mostly I think coming from the mainland, and it wasn't a huge community. It was one of the kind of middle-sized communities on the island when we were there. And that was my first experience of the Kirtan with them, and I became very interested in it. So I went back and I stayed in the community for a while, and I kind of experienced the same thing there. People were coming from all over the world and intersecting with this place, kind of mobile middle class from all over the place, right? We're landing there. Then what I found really interesting and part of what prompted the writing of what became this chapter in this presentation also was that I went to India after this. And I went to another yoga community there with my wife. We went to the Ananda Yoga community, which was founded by Swami Kriyananda in Northern California, where Michael also used to live, right? Michael and Ann used to live. But they have places kind of all over the world. And I found the musical practices themselves were so strikingly similar, which shouldn't be a big surprise in the sense that they're coming from kind of the same root, but they weren't using the ukulele, but they were using the harmonium. So that was very similar. What was also interesting is this is where I saw how it became transnational, in the sense that this practice, it was speaking to kind of like a global middle class from an ethnographic perspective, right? Because there were definitely a lot of middle class Indians participating in that community, at the Ananda community that was just outside of Pune that we stayed at. So there were also people from other parts of the world there as well, from North America. I'm trying to remember where else, some people from Europe, but there were South Asians. You know, it was a very, very almost identical practice. And this is what my wife and I were just shocked by this, just how identical it was all the way on the other side of the world. But it was a different audience. But the practice itself was there. Now, that being said, another thing I was looking at in the research, and I think that's part, I just want to back up and say that's part of what makes this sound thing feel a little bit more universal, in that that part was so structurally similar. But I was paying attention to other things in the field, like what do we eat when we go, right? So at Polestar on 4th of July, we have a barbecue, but it's a vegetarian barbecue, and there's no alcohol, there's kombucha, there's veggie burgers, right? And we had this great cook, David, there. So it's a very distinctly like American and yet yogic diet that's taking place there. But then when you're in South Asia, of course, you're not eating all those things. You're eating more regional foods and other things. So outside of the musical practices, there were a lot of variations, you could say, as I started to move around in these communities and see, yes, there are people from South Asia there, but the music somehow, and they're also using the same books. You know, you see the same books on the shelves. It's a very transnational practice. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think that's where the question was going, right? Yeah. Looks like Eva might be typing. Yeah, she said thank you. Okay. Michael, do you want to add anything to that?
No, that all sounds good. That sounds right. That would be kind of mind blowing to go all the way over there and see the same books and the same chants. And this is where sound in South Asian traditions, it's universal in a sense, right? You're not going to hear necessarily the same songs and all that, but in both places, the sound was intended to have a similar effect according to this Kriya Yoga practice that I described to you. So, yeah.
So I have a curiosity actually. I'm going to ask Bayan also the lady over there.
Vina.
Yeah. Vina.
Vina.
Yeah. So I'm wondering those yoga practices and perhaps Indian diasporic yoga practices or South Asian diasporic yoga practices, do they mingle with each other, or they actually go with their own flows?
I mean, this is what makes the transnational distribution of these practices so interesting. They change and they don't change. And I think part of what's happened with the Kriya Yoga practice is because the Ananda community was founded in California, what you're seeing is something that was founded in California and back up in South Asia. The same template of practice ends up back in South Asia, kind of like the pizza effect, right? And the people who are participating are like, yeah, this is yoga. But it's something that was developed in California and has taken on a life of its own, but it also has a lot of the same structural similarities in South Asia at the same time. So what this requires, and I think what makes ethnography of yoga so interesting, is very careful attention in very particular traditions and places to what's taking place, because you will, when you dig down deeper, you will find the differences. For example, like I said, with the food at these places, it's very different. You'll find continuities and you will find discontinuities. And that is what makes doing this research really, for me, so fun on the ground, being with these people and practicing these things and seeing all of these various changes as it moves around. So I know we're reaching the end of time here, Tina. We probably, yeah.
I was just wondering, are there some Kirtan topics that are particularly popular, specifically?
Topics? Or
Yeah.
what do you mean by topics? By
Like themes of what they're singing about.
oh, what they're singing about.
Yes.
You actually I thought it was great that Michael started with the Hawaiian chant that they often do there, right? Because that's very much from Hawaii, but now they're in Fort Collins
So
doing.
that was about nature.
Yeah, it's about nature. Yeah, so you'll hear the Hawaiian chants a lot, which of course often refer to nature, the elements and things like that. But then you also hear a lot of what Michael did second, which was the cosmic chants, which are very devotional to the divine, to the goddess, to the temple of your heart. You know, they're very, very devotional in nature. Yeah, so that's another genre, so to speak. And I remember when we were there, actually, one of the interesting ways that Michael put the music, categorized the music, the Kirtan music, was that we'd be sitting around in the morning about to have our morning meeting, and somebody would be just playing on the ukulele and everybody would be laughing and having a good time. And then Michael would be like, okay, all right, everybody, that was a great Rajasic song, like Rajas, very active and entertaining. Now let's play a Sattvic song to kind of get into the mood of devotion. And then we would play something that would be more devotional, that would bring us into a more kind of meditative space, so to speak. So this was the way I remember it at Kirtan, being divided up into different moods and bhavas that it could kind of like create for the practitioner. And we did it all. I have pictures of us sitting out on the lawn on 4th of July playing ukulele, and everybody's just laughing and having a good time, right? That same instrument, though, can end up in the temple and produce something entirely different. And so they would differentiate the way they were using it, the songs they were playing on it, to try to create a more sattvic, devotional kind of atmosphere for the people there. Yeah. I learned a lot while I was there.
And perhaps the surfing.
And surfing too.
From,
yes.
From the yoga community members, so we're doing Hawaii.
So thank you, Michael, and thank you, Vina, for joining.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Michael.
I'll be in touch. I took some videos of you. I'll send them to you.
Okay, thank you, lovely people online.
Right.
Great night. And